Ladies and gentlemen, I think it's time for us to begin. But before we start, can I request you all to please put your hands together, give a big round of applause for the dignitaries present amongst us, and also each one of you who's made it for this wonderful session. Fasten your seatbelts after you settle down, and make sure you put your phones on silent mode. We are about to begin. All right, ladies and gentlemen, once more, let's give a big round of applause to all of us. Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us for Global Investors Meet Karnataka. Invest Karnataka 2025, where we are reimagining the growth. What a pleasure to have you all here. जो हिंदुस्तान से हैं देवियों और सज्जनों आप सभी का स्वागत है और कुछ ही लम्हों में हम इस कार्यक्रम को शुरू करने वाले हैं सिंस इट इज इन्वेस्ट कर्नाटक कन्नड़दವರು ಯಾರಾದರೂ ಇದ್ರೆ ಒಮ್ಮೆ ಚಪ್ಪಾಳೆ ತಟ್ಟಿ ಎಲ್ಲರಿಗೂ ಸ್ವಾಗತ ಸುಸ್ವಾಗತ ಸೂಪರ್ అండ్ తెలుగు మాట్లాడే వాళ్ళకి అందరికీ నమస్కారం ఫర్ ఆల్ దిస్ people from different parts of the country and various parts of the world. A hearty welcome to each one of you. Ladies and gentlemen, have those smiles on your faces because it just feels great when you look at the smiles from the stage. You know, so many people smiling together. The very more reason for us to smile more today for this spectacular session is because the speakers are such. And those speakers are moderated by a person who's flawless in talking and who's inspired many, who's also been rewarded for various aspects. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm talking about the moderator who's going to take over this session, which is thriving in turbulence, how nations can build lasting resilience. The moderator for this session is the founder and CEO of Ink Talks, is a renowned entrepreneur and curator who founded Ink Talks in 2010, inspired by the Tech Talks model. Born and raised in India, she moved to US for higher education, graduating from the University of Madras and earning an MBA from the University of Illinois. After working with leading companies like Intel and American Express, she returned to India to establish Ink Talks, a non-profit platform showcasing innovative ideas and inspiring stories from around the world. Under her leadership, Ink Talks became a leading platform for Indian innovation and creativity, earning her recognition as one of the 100 most influential women in India by the Economic Times. Ladies and gentlemen, for this inspiring moderator who's joining us on stage, please put your hands together for founder and CEO of Ink Talks, Lakshmi Pratsuri. Thank you so much for joining us, Lakshmi. A great session, and you're flawless in your talks, and the stage is all yours, and you'll be introducing the speakers. Once more, ladies and gentlemen, let's hear it for Lakshmi.
Good morning, everyone. Slight correction, I didn't go to University of Madras. I went to Osmania University, Bajaj Institute, IIT Bombay, Portland State University, etc., etc. But what I'm here to talk about today is my passion for showcasing amazing people and telling stories. I moved back to India in 2010 because I really believed that there is amazing work happening here and we need to tell the story in our own voices. So now, 14 years later, 500 talks later, movies like Padman, Skies, Pink, everything that has come out of the stories we have done. We have over 100 million views, and India is definitely established globally as a force to reckon with. For that, we are truly proud. And yes, let's give it up for India and all of you and the most amazing people that make it here and the most amazing people that come from all over the world to be part of our conversations here. So I always like starting with stories. We are talking about resilience under turbulence. So this is a story of a teenager who's going through terrible times, goes to the parent and says, I just don't know how to deal with this world. So the parent says, okay, let me show you. He boils, put hot water, he puts a potato in one, puts an egg in one, puts a tea in one. And then he says, okay, look at the egg. It's really hard to soft to start with, and it comes back as hard-boiled egg. So some people just become negative. And look at something like a potato. It goes in hard, but comes back so soft. You know, some people lose it. But look at the tea. It goes in, and because of the heat, it flavors the water and comes out as something that you can consume. And it's up to you how you deal with turbulence. Do you want to turn soft, hard, or do you want to change the flavor? And I think we have two people here with us. As we were designing this session, we wanted to invite people who have grace through the turbulence. It's not just about dealing with it and somehow coming out with it, but what do you do with it and how do you turn it into your strength? And I'm really thrilled to invite today two people. One is, and I'll tell you a little bit about why I invited them before I invite them onto the stage. The first one is George Papandreou, who is the ex-Prime Minister of Greece, who I have been privileged to be a friend for many years now. And he is the one who headed Greece when it was going through the worst time, when the country was going bankrupt. He is the one who turned it around. And we also have Shashi Tharoor, who needs no introduction, and someone who has, I met Shashi when he was Under Secretary General with Kofi Annan. So we had an invitation to meet Kofi Annan, and I wrote immediately to his secretary and said, can you make sure Shashi Tharoor would be there? So when we went to meet with Kofi Annan, he joked saying, I know why you're here really, not to meet me, to meet my Under Secretary General. So that was in year 2000. I met Shashi, and it's been wonderful to see his, what can you say, journey. That's the only word to describe it. With that, there's no better leaders to talk about resilience through turbulence. George and Shashi, please join me.
Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Shashi Tharoor and George Papandreou.
So I'm not, we prepared some questions, etc., but I'm never worried about conversation when George and Shashi are together. There are so many things to talk about, and 1 hour is just too little. But I thought maybe I'll just start a little bit about each of you talking about the turbulences you faced. So, George, I thought I would start with you and say that you studied in America. You're pretty much an American, and your father was in politics, and you went back to Greece, and you became the Prime Minister at probably the worst time in Greece's history in terms of when it was going through turbulence, as a company almost under the brinks of bankruptcy, and really turned it around. So tell us a little bit about what helped you, what made you come out of that. And we have come out of that.
Thank you very much, Lakshmi, and very nice to be here, and with Shashi particularly. Yes, we have worked together in the past at a time when you were in the United Nations and almost became Secretary General.
Yes.
Which would have been quite an important, I think, change for the world, as India should be on the Security Council as a permanent member in sometimes. But yes, I was, of course, American, but I lived in Greece, and we went through a dictatorship. My father was in jail, my grandfather in jail. We went into exile in Sweden, in France, in Canada, and then the UK. So a bit of a gypsy life. That maybe helped me a little bit in dealing with the global crisis, because this was not a Greek crisis only. We had our problems. Greece, if you remember, the financial crisis started in the Wall Street. It was a banking crisis. It was a fraud, basically, of the bankers, and the unchecked capitalist development of capital, being able to sell bonds that were not really AAA. They were fraudulent bonds. But then when the banks were saved, the markets looked and saw, okay, then there's some countries that maybe have some big debts, and we were targeted by the markets, and that's when I became Prime Minister. So I took on a very difficult task of having to save my country from bankruptcy, but at the same time dealing with the European Union that didn't know how to, had never experienced it as a European Union, the question of a bankruptcy. And supposedly inside the constitution of the European Union, we could not be bailed out. That was not a possibility, so we had to change things. But I had to deal with the markets, I had to deal with the bankers, I had to deal with the global situation, all eyes on Greece, lest we become sort of a black hole to bring everybody down. And at the same time, I had to comfort our own citizens who were taking the burden of this change. I think that my resilience was being able to understand as much as I could. And you know, in a time of crisis, well, you don't really have much time to study. I was not an expert in the bond markets, so you have to rely on what you've learned. If you have time, and that I think is important in resilience, and we are now facing a world of uncertainty, of unpredictability, of major changes, possibly for the better, possibly for the worse. And I think what we need is to prepare to be societies that can deal with crises, and that means, I believe, societies that are much more open, much more democratic, much more participative, and where we actually educate our citizens to be citizens. We don't do that very much. We educate for professions, but not for being citizens. I don't think any one leader, no matter how much we sometimes put our faith in a so-called strongmen, I don't like the word because I don't really think that they are really strong men when they take all the power. I think we need to put our faith much more in trusting our citizens as a resource in dealing with resilience. So that's what I tried to do, make reforms in Greece such that would bring citizens to the fore. We actually had, while we were going through this crisis, I implemented a policy of, we called it wiki laws. What does that mean? You know what Wikipedia is. So rather than having us create all the laws in the cabinet and taking them to Parliament, I would publish all our proposals on the web and ask for citizens' input, and then come back to the cabinet and say, okay, here are our citizens' input. Let's see what our citizens say. And actually, the wisdom of our citizens was often even much better than some of our best bureaucrats or experts. So I believe resilience, if we were talking about resilience, we really need to make our societies resilient and ready for the unpredictability and a sense of solidarity and community and welfare in our societies if we want to be able to deal with the major challenges we have ahead.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So Shashi, you've been at United Nations, and today the world has changed so much since you left. And what is the role of organizations like United Nations, WHO, NATO, all these things in preventing turbulence? A lot of these things are there. I mean, you've been at UNHCR, you've been through various things. I mean, all these organizations are there to contain turbulence across the globe per se. What do you think is their relevance today, and in what way should we adapt them to contain the turbulence or prevent it or manage it?
Well, the relevance comes from the mere fact that they exist, that they offer a platform for every country on earth to get together and to cooperate in common outcomes. Their effectiveness, I'm afraid, varies from issue to issue and from time to time. See, the World Bank and the IMF would be the institutions you would be looking at, and the WTO to some degree, when you're talking about economic turbulence. But they each have their challenges. At the moment, the WTO's dispute resolution mechanism has been crippled by, in effect, an American boycott. The World Bank is now increasingly seen as playing with the margins of the global economy and not the central issues. And the IMF, a similar problem, though the IMF, of course, has more exposure to the private sector. And if there has been a transition that lies behind the turbulence, as George was also implying about 2008 and 9, it is a dominance of the private sector over governmental economic management. Now, in his case, as he was saying, you had a situation where banking fraud and these illusory credit debit swaps and all these funny financial instruments that people had come up with to make themselves money not only laid themselves low, but laid down the rest of the system, because in an increasingly globalized world, everybody was connected. But that was not something the UN bodies could have done anything about. It was the international financial system that was connected, the banks. So why was Greece affected? Why did the Icelandic government collapse? You know, this sort of, there were lots of countries affected, which had nothing to do with the institutions that had made the mistakes or the fraud and brought these countries down. So this is something where, honestly, in a sense, you could argue it's unfair to judge the international institutions by their failure to cope with that. Similarly, look at the UN. Everyone says the UN is hopelessly ineffective because of the Ukraine war, its helplessness in that, the collapse of the Syrians to the rebel movement, all of that. Where is the peace and security mechanism, etc.? But is that the only yardstick by which we must judge the UN? I would turn around and say, look at the UN's good work in setting the global agenda on so many issues. The so-called problems without passports, to coin a phrase that Kofi Annan used to use, the problems that cross all frontiers, and that every human being has to be affected by, is affected by, and that you can't fence off, you can't fence off climate change in the sky. You can't deal with environmental issues without cooperation, human trafficking, drug abuse. There are so many problems that require countries to cooperate, and the UN and its agencies are still the first port of call and the best port of call for all of that. Could we have dealt with COVID without WHO? No. Could WHO have done better? Yes. But the problem is, there's also some of these limitations that are built in by design. The UN system was created by a world of sovereign states. No sovereign state was prepared to truly surrender its sovereignty. They were prepared to pool their sovereignty to commonly leverage it, but they wanted to preserve their clout. So in WHO, China exercised a disproportionate clout as somebody which is as a major donor to WHO, just as in the Security Council, the Americans exercise a disproportionate clout, but so do the Russians when it comes to any attempt to sanction them on Ukraine. And so it goes. You have to accept that the UN is a mirror of the world. It reflects all our inequalities, all our differences, all our divisions. And if we are prepared to accept that out of a spirit of realism, then I think we'll be able to say that it's better than the alternative. There's a great line by Dag Hammarskjöld 75 years ago. He said that the UN was never intended to take mankind to paradise, but rather to save humanity from hell.
Beautiful.
Sometimes the best the UN can do is prevent things from getting even worse.
Yeah. And I think, George, talking about engaging citizens into what we do, I want you to talk about a couple of things. Once you were talking about how Ireland has done that in engaging citizens. And then, Shashi, after that, I'd love for you to talk about, you've been talking a lot about leadership without borders. Like it's sort of, if we have a problem, why should it be solved only by somebody from the same country? So maybe you can talk, George, first about how you've seen citizens being engaged in solving problems, and then we'll have Shashi talk about
yes,
ideas.
I'm very much in favor of the citizens being involved. I would like to add something and agree with what Shashi said. The institutions we have are, well, maybe begin a little bit further back, maybe to ancient Greece. Politics. What is politics? Now, sometimes it's considered a bad word, politics and politicians, but actually the word politics means being a citizen, and actually it means the possibility that we can imagine collectively our fate, and we can change our world collectively. So politics is using our common imagination, our collective imagination for a better world. And how do we do this if we have tyrants, or we cannot? They would take the power. So then the ancient Greeks said, well, an innovation, the word was innovated. There were other maybe forms of ancient democracies, but the word of democracy was an innovation. If we think of democracy as an innovation, then we should think of our institutions. Can we design them? We have the power to design and innovate our institutions to be more effective in our world. And in the global level, as you said, these are institutions that have been created many years ago, but the powers that have changed, the technological powers, the globalization of capitalism, the movement of peoples and so on, have changed the powers, and private powers have become often much more strong than governments, much more powerful than governments, and sometimes capturing governments and creating, and that's what we had with the banking crisis. And it also means that at the global level we have to see how we cooperate. As you said, no problems, these problems do not have passports. Well, when I was dealing with the financial crisis, I could not deal with this alone as Greece. This was a global issue. And I was talking with Europe, I was talking with the bankers. I had calls from Obama, from China, from Saudi Arabia, from many countries, wondering how they could help or what they would do in order not to make the problem bigger. And of course, climate and pandemics and migration, these are problems we cannot deal with alone. And Europe, of course, is a construction where we have given up sovereignty, not to lose it, but to strengthen our common will. So I think we need to think of this at a time when people are looking more inwards. We actually need to look more cooperatively. And I know, Shashi, I think you would agree with this. Are we moving towards a rule-based world, or are we moving towards a world of where the rule is of the powerful and they decide? And I think this is one of the major global dilemmas. How do we change that? Well, that's a whole political struggle by nations, but by societies. Within our societies, I believe we can find ways to decentralize power by giving more voice to our citizens. And I think some of the frustrations we see with the growth of demagoguery, I like that word better than populism, is the fact that people feel frustrated. They are not being heard. They are not being involved. So we have been, and I have been involved at the European level in experimentation. How can we design democracy in a different way? Well, it's not so simple to experiment on people. But if we look in the history, we look at our experiences, or our different experiences, that is a way to maybe look at pilot projects of what has happened. So in ancient Athens, not everything was good. Women did not have citizenship, slaves were there, but they did have some interesting ideas. One of them was randomly selecting citizens so they would be actually representative of the total population. We call them today mini-publics also, and say, okay, we have this problem. Why don't you as citizens give us your view, and this will be good for our politicians to think about.
What they call a focus group today.
Yeah.
Focus groups.
Or a jury selection in America.
Yes, random selection, and actually with some power. So what Ireland did, Ireland had a big problem. Well, a big problem. They are a Catholic country, very anti-abortion, religiously at least. But they were worried about what they should do about this issue. The politicians did not want to talk about it because it was very highly controversial and very risky. So they said, let's try a citizens' assembly. They randomly chose a number, I think there was around 200 Irish citizens, randomly, completely randomly. Some of the politicians, parliamentarians were in this group also, and for 6 months they deliberated. They brought in experts, they brought in legal experts, they brought in doctors, they brought in entrepreneurs, and they decided on the issue of abortion, which was very controversial, that yes, they have to change the Constitution and legalize it. That was the proposal from the citizens. That went to a referendum, and it actually changed. So these are new methods of deepening democracy and giving voice to our citizens, and I think this is a way forward. But of course, this also means fighting a lot of the concentrated power, which does not want to give up this power to the citizens. In citizens we trust. If we want a democracy, we first have to, we want citizens to trust us or our institutions, we first have to trust our citizens.
Yeah.
Well, George, I'd agree with you. And in fact, we too in India, in a more modest way, are also trying your wiki laws approach. Not for every law, but for a handful of laws, particularly on issues that affect the average citizen. For example, the IT laws, the data protection law, and so on. They are putting it up on the website of the ministry and inviting public comments. Now, in practice, in a country like ours, 95% of the population are going to check the ministry's website. So they will get comments only from a certain self-selected class, including NGOs, civil society activists, the people who care. But it's sort of a halfway step towards the kind of thing, citizens' participation, that you're talking about. But having said that, I wonder whether you and I are speaking of a world that may be in the process of being eclipsed. Do you think Mr. Trump believes in leadership beyond borders? He will never accept the proposition. First of all, within his borders, he wants to be absolute, and beyond his borders, he doesn't want anyone to interfere with him. Now, he's quite willing to change his borders. He wants Greenland and Panama and Gaza and God knows what else.
Maybe he wants a borderless world where America is simply one country all over the world. Huh?
I think the problem there is we would outvote him very quickly if that happened to us. But
if he would accept voting.
But jokes apart, I do believe we are witnessing a revival of autocracy, maybe too strong a word, but of leaders who are more determined to exercise clout. And let me give you a couple of variables that you want to think about, George. One is the financial crisis taught us about the vulnerability of national governments and national financial institutions to international forces. The COVID crisis taught us about how the global supply chains actually can be deleterious. America waking up one morning and realizing that their entire supply of their favorite headache remedy, ibuprofen, comes from China, and China was shut down for 3 months. So suddenly you couldn't get Advil in America for 3 months, okay? Now, suddenly everyone said, hey, wait a minute, we are learning that we need to be more in control of our economies, of our policies, of our imports, of our production chains, and of our country. And the result, it seems to me today, is the rise of a Trump and his equivalents in many European countries who are basically saying, we're here for us first. Trump unabashedly says America first. And I think for us to be in denial of that reflects our idealism. I spent my 29 years at the United Nations, so I have this internationalist vision. You come from the one continent where you were prepared to look beyond your national sovereignty. The Maastricht Treaty was signed by Greece and others. You've got an EU that is gradually converging into common institutions, common policies. So you and I may not be fully focused on what the reality is for somebody whose slogan is "Make America Great Again." And, you know, I think we've got to be realistic in realizing the world is perhaps changing. And in this world, Lakshmi, to go back to your question, leaders want to be stronger behind their own borders rather than be leaders without borders.
See, I wonder if it's got anything to do with the state of affairs in the world. Like, for example, if you're handling a kindergarten class where everything is chaotic, you need a very stern voice. When you're handling, very sophisticated audience, you need to have a servant leadership. So it all depends on which end of the spectrum. Is it that most of us are feeling that, my God, the world is going out of control now, and look to somebody to solve it? I mean, are we in that stage where, whether we like it or not, when a majority elects somebody and there is a certain behavior, is it showing what is happening in the world? And I mean, we can say we have nothing to do about it, but I think it'll be interesting to see. Is it like, I mean, for example, in America, so many people losing their jobs to something outside, and so many people feeling that these foreigners are richer than us, and so many people feeling like, hey, I have no recourse.
Yeah, why are we voting for elites that are shipping our jobs off to Shanghai and Bangalore?
Exactly.
That's a question people have.
Exactly.
And that's why they voted for Trump.
Right. So I'm just saying, is it a reflection of where the world is? And so what can we do a little bit to change that, this hyperventilation of, oh my God, like the world is falling apart feeling? What can we do to bring a sense of, in fact, if you think about, Stone Ages to now, we are actually doing damn good, So what do we need to do to bring a sense of calmness? Because right now everybody is riled up, worried, and maybe that's the reason a certain leadership is looked upon.
Well, I absolutely agree with you, Shashi, that we should not be in denial that we are seeing greater tendencies towards concentration of power, autocracies, oligarchies, if you like, or plutocracies. I mean, look at the inauguration of Trump. You had the plutocracy on demonstration in the front lines there, the richest people in the world, and it's not just the digital, it's also the other ones. And what I see is that we, even though the MAGA idea is America first, in the end it's in America's interest, and I have lived in America, so have you, and you of course
grew up in America.
Yes, I grew up in many, both in California, but also on the East Coast. And it is in the interest of the United States, if they are going to deal with global problems, climate, pandemic, whatever else, whatever may come. But of course, what we are seeing, I believe, is a concentration of power outside of the institutions of democracy, which is so big it actually captures democracy. So when you have lobbying, when you have corruption, when you have the billionaires having more money than most of our countries, maybe not India, but they have their personal wealth is more than the GDP of most countries in the world.
Absolutely.
They yield more power than us politicians. We are asked to decide for the world. They actually have the power to decide or even corrupt decisions and capture decisions. When that happens, there is injustice. So you see, United States, one of the richest, or maybe the richest country in the world, with the highest level of inequality, with huge problems of unemployment, going into the Midwest, cities that look like ghost towns. And this is, of course, because capital, we had the social contract in the past, where employers, employees, and the government sat down and said, yes, capitalist country, capitalist market, you will make your profit, but you have a responsibility to society for education, for health, for working conditions, for the environment today. Now, when capital flees in a globalized capitalist economy, it has no responsibility to its country. When I was asked to tax by the IMF, to tax my citizens to deal with the debt, I said to them, yes, I will, but can you tax the rich? They said, yes, of course. I said, yes, but they move. They go to tax havens, they go out. So I will have to tax the middle class and the wage earner, and that would be very, very, and that's what happened, of course, and that was very unjust. When you have that injustice, that creates anger towards the system, and this is where you have these demagogues creating a sense of I can be decisive, but decisive for whom? Decisive for the people or decisive for this oligarchy? And that is what I think Trump is. He is decisive, but he's decisive for the oligarchy. He will face a wall. Now, when these people, these autocratic leaders, when they face a wall, what do? When they face a country, they find a scapegoat, and the scapegoat will be the Chinese, the Indians, migrants. It will be some other problem, or it would be the internal enemy or LGBTQ. And I have seen this in Europe with Hungary, for example, and Orban. He has become the oligarch leader of his country, but his facade is, we don't want migrants. They don't even have migrants in Hungary. We don't want this, these bad European laws about human rights and so on. That is his facade. Behind that, it is the consolidation of power. So we have to fight that.
So
this is what we have to fight.
To continue that, I mean, Shashi, maybe you can address how one of the biggest things is this, the disproportionate power. It used to be 80-20, now it's like 5-95, I think. 5% controlling 95%. I'm sorry, what is that sound? There's like, oh, outside, okay. Sorry. So
an army marching, it sounds like.
So what can we do, maybe in India, what can we do to create a more equitable society? Because I think most of the problems, I think he's right, come from inequality and huge. And in India, at least in the last 20 years, because of IT, you see it, there's more middle class than ever before. Is there stuff in India we can do by watching all this to create less inequality?
Well, as you know, the Indian answer is redistribution. I mean, both George and I come from a kind of social democratic orientation. And the truth is that this business of saying, yes, you can conduct your business, grow and prosper, but the revenues you give us, and you better give us revenues, will be distributed to the left out, the marginalized, the weaker, so they too can participate in the fruits of growth. I mean, that's basically the approach that we all have. And in India, this means, because people have so little at the bottom of the pyramid, that you have to redistribute. I mean, why is it that Mr. Modi's government is boasting about giving 800 million people free food grains? I mean, that's actually an admission of failure, that we've not been able to empower them enough that they can afford to buy their own food grains, that you have to give it to them. But it masks a whole lot of other things. Now, the other question is, are there other paths to equity? I've been very well behaved politically in not drawing a parallel between what George said about Mr. Orban and what we could say here about the BJP government. in terms of their increasing.
So let's talk about the future. Where can we go?
But I'm just saying,
Yeah.
there is very much a sense that governments in many countries, okay, let me not, but you can certainly name Hungary, Turkey, India, and many more, possibly a more extreme example would be Beijing and Mr. Xi, that they are essentially determining that autonomous institutions, participative institutions, and so on are only okay in as much as they can control them. And that control is more important. But in all fairness, at least to Orban and Modi and Erdogan, they're getting elected despite doing that. The public, in other words, seems to be privileging effectiveness over equity. You're talking about how do we promote equality. The public is turning around and saying what we want is effectiveness from government. So that's the real answer. You need a government that both encourages equality but is also effective in addressing the core issues of the people and of the economy. And this is something all of us need to learn, whether in government or the opposition in India. When we are in power in a state like Karnataka, we have to be effective in Karnataka. We have to address the problems of the people. And then we can more credibly oppose those policies of the central government that fail to do that. Equally, the central government gets a free pass from the voters for some of their excesses in hollowing out the autonomous institutions and so on, provided they deliver. Provided they deliver the redistributive policies, provided they look after the Aam Aadmi, the common man, all of that stuff. Then people are saying, fine, we'll let you get away with it, so long as you deliver. The moment you stop delivering, we'll vote against you. Now, that's the one check and balance that democracy offers. Now, that doesn't always mean it's enough. You know, there's this, I don't know what you think of it, George, but in Europe there is the Varieties of Democracy Institute in Stockholm. And they issue an annual report, and last year they downgraded India from a democracy to an electoral autocracy. They're saying, yes, you have free and fair elections, but once you've elected your leaders, they can conduct themselves as autocrats. And that is not democracy. Now, that's not true in Greece yet or in Europe, but it's probably not too far removed from what you're seeing in Hungary or Turkey.
Well, we have our problems in Greece too, so I wouldn't want to make it, even though we are the birthplace of democracy and you are the biggest democracy, so we have this connection. But we are seeing an erosion of democratic norms. We are seeing the concentration of power. And it's not just in people who are in government, but also the whole economic situation where oligarchs basically influence government and are in cahoots with the oligarchs, and this concentration. And when we talk about efficiency, that's what our citizens need. They want efficient governments, but if they only hand it over to governments or to the top people there, after a while, this power can be concentrated and they become less efficient, I believe. Efficient at least, not efficient for citizens, not efficient for the average citizen, because they are then beholden to these other powers. I mean, if you look at in the United States, to become an elected official, you have to have millions and millions of dollars, and you have to go around asking for contributions to be elected. So who can be elected? Either you have to have a lot of money yourself, you have to be well known possibly as maybe a star in Hollywood or something, or you have to ask for money from donors who then you are beholden to. And of course, corruption can be part of this too. So this is one thing I am seeing around the world, unluckily even in my country too. That was one reason why we had the financial crisis. The financial crisis wasn't just because we were overspending. The money we were spending by the previous government I took over from was given to the friends of the government and not spent well. So the people's money was not spent in the public interest. And that is what efficiency should be, a democratic efficiency. One thing I did, which was again inspired by the ancient Greeks, what they did in Athens, when they had some public money being spent, they had to write it on the wall. There was a marble wall, they had plaques, and you could, as a citizen, go and take it to court. So every single resource, every single expenditure was written on the wall. So I said, how do I take that ancient concept and make it a modern concept? I said, well, we have the web. So let us make a law. I made a simple law. No expenditure, whether it's central or local in Greece, is legal unless it is posted on the web. Now, that initially people didn't really understand it. Today, that is where everybody gets their information. And that immediately starts to break the corruption and bring more transparency. It's not enough. But what I'm saying is that we need to understand the problem that our democracies are going through. We are actually seeing the lack of democracies. People say, can democracy work for us? Can it do well and so on? Actually, I don't think that we are real democracies. If you look at the United States, it's become a plutocracy. And going back to the concept of democracy, when the ancient Greeks coined the term, one of the basic reasons, there are many reasons to have democracy, one is to have non-violent solutions. So we discuss and debate and we vote, that's non-violent. We find compromise. But another one was not to have concentration of power. Democracy was not to have. So when we're seeing so much concentration of power, basically we are seeing the undermining of our democratic institutions and our democratic prospects, which means taking the voice away from you, and you can vote every so many years, but that's about it, and you can tweet or you can do this and that, but that is a false empowerment. That's not a real empowerment.
So, at the end of the day, we all agree that however flawed, democracy is the best of the lot that we have going, and it has its problems, etc. But if we can look at it from today and say, we are also saying citizens, human resource is a really, really big part of that. So for us to have an effective democracy, for us to continue, the thing that amazes me is that no matter what we say, at least in India, we seem to, the people know what's going on. When they vote, people know what they do. People show up actually to vote. So whatever it is, it's flawed. Whatever it is, that's the best system we got going. I would like each of you to talk a little bit about the biggest resource we have, which is the human resource that we have. So for us to have an equitable world, forget democracy, autocracy, whatever it may be, what are some of the things we need to do with our human resource to better educate them, to better have them question things, and especially with this social media, people are blindly following things without questioning anything. So how do we make sure we invest in our human resource? Because I think once that gets better, everything else gets better. So
right.
What would you like to say about resilience?
Education and skilling are the two obvious answers. We actually conducted an amazing experiment by granting the vote to a country that was only, in those days, 16% literate. So 84% of the people in this country were illiterate when they got the vote. And there's been no precedent for that anywhere on the planet. Today, obviously, the numbers are different, but we're still not 100% literate.
Yeah.
And nonetheless, people have been able to exercise agency through the vote. Now, I've always argued, and this is not a new argument, I must have first published it 30 years ago, that as our electorate becomes more educated, they will demand more of their politicians, and that we will move away from a politics of identity to a politics of performance. Too much of Indian politics, as you remember, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, even early 90s, or even 90s, became reduced to voting for people of an identity you could relate with. So if you cast your vote, you vote your caste.
Vote your caste, yes.
Or you nowadays increasingly with the BJP, there's a message that is often anchored in a religious community identity. Now, this sort of thing has obviously severe limits, because if you're voting for somebody because you share an identity in common with him or her, you are no longer asking the questions, is she good for me? Is she good in terms of the policies that I believe in? Is she going to do the kinds of things as a lawmaker or as a member of the executive that I want to see happening in my country? And those are the questions an educated voter would be asking themselves. So the short answer is yes, we need to educate people better. The second thing is you need to empower them. Now, how do you empower them? First of all, you empower them by employing them. If they are educated and unemployed, and we have, as you know, the world's largest number of educated unemployed in the world, the highest number of college graduates without jobs in any country in the world is in India. And that's a very worrying thing for me. I want to see people getting the opportunity to contribute productively to society and the economy, on the one hand by being employed, and on the other hand to improve their own lives and dream better. And there is nothing more dangerous for a society than legions of unemployed and even worse, unemployable young men. So that's that's a different footnote. But coming back to this, once people have the skills required to be employed in the world of the 21st century, then only can you meaningfully empower them, and I don't think we fully got there yet. You know, your topic talks about resilience. Now, how do you build resilience in a world where the change is so dizzyingly rapid? I remember reading a report from the Oxford Martin School about 3 years ago that said, at that time, they said 30% of the jobs in the world in 2030 will be jobs that don't exist today. Now, how do you tell a teacher to train a kid for a job that doesn't exist? Their textbooks obviously are completely out of date by the time that job comes along. People are still thinking of the things that are going to be those jobs. Indeed, we know that's true already, because in the 3 years since the Martin School report came out, AI has completely transformed aspects of the job market, right? So what do you do? And the answer to that clearly is, and I say this to teachers all the time when I address audiences of teachers, I say, don't teach the young people what to think, teach them how to think. Ultimately, how to think is what's going to equip them for this uncertain world, where they're going to be confronting facts, ideas, information they've never encountered before, certainly not in their classrooms or their textbooks, but which they will have to figure out a way to approach, understand, and overcome. And to do that, you need to know how to do that, how to think your way through a problem. So those are the kinds of resilience skills that you need in your human resources. You need people who are empowered, you need people who are able to think independently and where possible out of the box, and you need people who can adapt to change.
Right.
Adaptability is part of the answer for human resources.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a classic problem which is not going to go away, of the number of people being thrown out of work in developed economies today who are in their 50s. And you say, what do I do now? The answer, the glib answer, is retrain. But by that time you're set in your ways, you probably you don't feel you have the equipment or the inclination to learn something completely new and ways of doing it, and these people essentially join the frustrated unemployed. Now, if that happens to you in your 30s or 40s, maybe you can be retrained. But these are questions that every country has to grapple with. And in our case, you know, just as we leapfrogged into cellular telephones before we had even wired the whole country for landline phones, similarly, we may have to be coping with the problems created by an AI world before we've even employed people in the analog era. And this is the kind of leap we'll have to make. And if our policy makers are not thinking on their feet, we're going to have real problems.
And I think that, you know, yes, policy makers can do something, but if you think of something like an IT revolution that happened in India, it didn't come from policy makers. It came from people doing something different. So I'd love to hear from you about what can we do to change people's thinking, because I think, you know, Shashi, you talk about this a lot also, about the soft skills. You know, we focus on hard skills of learn this formula, etc., but the soft skills of how do you question, how do you learn, how do you communicate, how do you articulate, how do you take your position. These are the things we have to teach our kids, especially in India. We don't teach our kids how to question. We tell them, don't ask any questions, just listen. So what do you think, and talking about both of you, you've had so many avatars in same life. You know, you've been a diplomat and a politician and a popular person and almost film actor, all kinds of stuff. And you, George, you've been a student and politician and so many things. I mean, how do you, maybe that's what we should leave everybody with, how do you reinvent yourself? Because when you came to India, you had no idea how to be a politician talking. I mean, I remember talking in Malayalam was like a, you know, big thing. And you, George, I mean, after being educated, however of a roaming person, you want to go and lead a country during turbulence. So maybe talk a little bit, both of you, about how do you reinvent yourself? What are your tricks?
Well, I think part of it is, and I agree very much with what Shashi said about the education system. It happened to be because of the dictatorship and my travels and my migration and refugee being, I went to 8 different schools in 4 different countries in 12 years. So I went to very different educational systems, and that made me think about, you know, that there is not one way, and made me critically think. So I think that we need to rethink of our educational systems, first of all, which are based on a somewhat industrial, military type of job, where you sit in a classroom, you learn something that's supposed to be for your whole life. As you said, we do not know what tomorrow's
Yeah.
professions will be. So we need to give very different skills. Very different skills. That doesn't mean that you don't have a direction or maybe a specific skill, but you need a wider skill. I actually asked the head of Fiat, Agnelli, once. I was Minister of Education. He was sitting next to me in an airplane. We were coming from Davos. I said, what would you want for employment? I'm Greek, and we have an employment too. And what kind of education would you like for your people? He said, of course he was Italian. He said philosophy. They have to learn philosophy. And I said, well, why philosophy? He said, well, they open up their horizon to everything. They can think of new ways. They will critically think and so on. So can we create critically thinking
Liberal
citizens?
arts.
Yes, but that is also linked to democracy, because if you have critically thinking citizens, if you have people that are resilient, you will have people who will criticize power, and that's very good, and they will see the wrongdoings, and they will be able to articulate this, and the vice versa. If you have democracy and you want people to make decisions for you, what do you want? You want a well-informed and well-educated populace, because they are going to make the decisions for society. So if you said, as you say, they were illiterate, obviously India thrived and went ahead, but the more educated, the better. And that's why in ancient Greece you had theater, you had a thriving of culture, theater, music, mathematics, games. These were all not just for fun. This was also a training of a citizen. Theater, if you read ancient Greek theater, it is mockery very often of the power. It said, okay, these powerful people, they think they're special and so on. And there was a lot of mockery, so it really was developing a sense of citizenship and a responsibility of citizens towards society. So education and democracy go together. Now, when we have an autocratic leader, they want the opposite. So the welfare is what you were mentioning, I think, that handing out something to poor, which in the end does not give them the skills to be self-sufficient, not to be able to, so you are becoming dependent on this clientelistic role. So how do we create the type of skills and the kind of empowerment of our citizens so they do not have to be dependent on some leader to say, today I think I will give you a bonus, or today I think I may give a little bit of this, a little bit of that. I've seen that in Greece, unluckily also. And secondly, they also define identity. They don't want you to be, if an autocrat decides, and that's why we talk about identity politics. So for example, Orban says, I will tell you what Hungarian is. It's not so much that he tells you what Hungarian is, he has the power to tell you what you should be. And any deviation from that is not being Hungarian. So can you imagine how anti-democratic that is, and how anti-critical thinking that is, and how powerful that is in a society to be able to control? Well, he should be saying, yes, being Hungarian can be a myriad of things. I mean, India, of course, is so diverse. But if you build on identity, and Amartya Sen has written a very, very beautiful piece on identity and violence, where he says we must accept this diversity, of course with some basic values for all, because this in the end is what a democratic society is, and it also is a society which can accept differences, can accept debate, can accept critical thinking, can accept actually that we can compromise and we don't have dividing lines which will end up in violence.
I mean, I agree with you that I think the whole basis of this is an educated population is a better population. So, you know, Shashi, I know when you first came, you did, like, for example, in Kerala, just teach people English because you felt that it's probably, not probably, in India, the most educated state, but people were not getting jobs because their English wasn't good. Sometimes it could be a soft skill like that that's important. So I just want to talk a little bit about what kind of soft skills should we inculcate in our children so that they are better prepared to ask questions and not just be sitting there, you know, accepting things thrown their way?
Well, we just have to encourage it. I'm frequently talking to schools and college teachers and saying, listen, don't just tell the kids, if they ask you why something is, that it's always been that way or that it's in the textbook. Try and explain. And if they ask you why not, however absurd the question may be, it's only by explaining why not. Why can't the sun rise one day in the west? I mean, you have to explain. And that's how they learn to think and to distinguish between what's feasible, what's not, and imagine things out of the box. I often tell the story of these. I wear glasses barely 5% of the day. And so there was a time when I would constantly lose, break, misplace my glasses. And I was complaining about it. I said, well, for 150 years, they made glasses to sit on your nose and hang on your ears, and I find that uncomfortable, especially since I don't need them most of the time, so I don't know what to do with them, and that's why it goes wrong. So he says, I'll find you a solution, and this is what he found. This is great. Because what is this? This is very simply, it stays around my neck all day long. I forget it's there, but I don't lose it, I don't misplace it, I don't have to find a pocket or a drawer for it. And then, when I need it, the 5% of the day that I need to look at a distance, I can just do this. 2 magnets in the middle, clicked in place, I can see you guys in the back, hi, and there we are. Now, why is this new? It's simply because for 150 years no one thought of it, suddenly someone did. And why can't you therefore reimagine pretty much the things that you thought couldn't be reimagined? Imagine if a kid 10, 15 years ago had talked about why do we need fuel or petrol for a car? And the teacher impatiently said, I'm sorry, that's the only way a car will move. You've got to get the engine to move, the motor needs it, you have to do it. And then that kid happened to be Elon Musk, and he went off and thought about a battery instead of a petrol engine. The point is that you can't and shouldn't discourage seemingly absurd questions, because it's from those completely sort of unimaginable, out-of-the-box kind of ideas that innovations come.
Yeah.
I mean, in my own lifetime, the changes I've seen, George and I are just born a few years apart, and we have seen a world which gave us, for the first time, everything from computers, personal computing, the internet, mobile telephony, satellite communications, the ability to watch events in real time halfway across the globe, the ability to speak halfway across the globe for free. Look, when I went to graduate school in America, it cost me $12 a minute to call mom. I didn't have the money. I couldn't do it. Today it's free on WhatsApp, right? I mean, so you've got transformations that we couldn't have imagined when we were becoming adults.
Yeah.
And the truth now is, there will be, for today's children, the same thing. Things I can't even dream of, somebody will dream of it and find a way to make it real, and it's going to happen. So again, I would stress the importance of adaptability. You asked about us and our own experiences. I've had to adapt a lot. Yes, I adapted to making 17 speeches a day in Malayalam after never having used the language for decades while I was internationally engaged. And it was fine, because in the initial stages when my Malayalam was still inadequate, and my opponents thought that's how they could defeat me. But I said, look at this guy, he can't even speak our language properly. He's used to sitting in New York in an air-conditioned office in a 3-piece suit. How can he represent us? And I would go to them and speak to them in Malayalam, and wearing Malayali clothes for the hot season of the election campaign. And I would say, you see that my Malayalam isn't great, but it's good enough to understand your hopes and your needs. But what's more important, I have the English and the Hindi to express them in Delhi, to get things done for you. Speaking good Malayalam in Delhi won't get you very far. And that clinched the vote. I won with a record majority. Yeah. So even these things, there are ways that you can deal with them. And ultimately, effectiveness is what matters.
Yeah.
If you're going to sit there and be ineffective, no one will want you back.
I agree.
And I hope the proof of the pudding is that I came back 4 times. Yeah. I mean, I want to keep trying to do it. But
congratulations.
I know, bravo. George, actually, we're talking about, even there's a certain sense of humor in dealing with that also, and a certain practicality. We should end on the story you said earlier about, this is Shashi's favorite topic also, talking to the British government about how much they stole from each of us, etc. And you were having conversations with the British government about returning some things to you guys. Can you tell us about your conversation?
The Elgin marbles, Parthenon marbles.
Yes. Well, this may have, we have this in common also. I think we have many other things too, but I know you have been fighting for the return of many of the artifacts from the colonial times here in India. And when I went to the British Parliament to vote to promote the idea of the return of the marbles, so the Parthenon is in the middle of Athens, a beautiful building from the time of Pericles. And Elgin, Lord Elgin, came to then the Ottoman Empire, stole most of the beautiful statues on the fresco of the frieze of the Parthenon, and took them to London, and there they are for more than a
He
century.
also showed up in Calcutta, I'm sorry to say.
He did also. Okay, so he has a story of this colonial.
There was an Elgin Road in Calcutta when I was growing up.
Okay, so
I'm sure the Greek consul wouldn't have been happy to see that. Sorry, God.
But this is a common history in a way. And so I went to the UK Parliament to talk to the special committee on the return of artifacts, and I said we need to have the return. First of all, it's one monument, so you can't have half of the monument in Athens and the other half in London. And one of the parliamentarians said, well, you know, it's very good in London because
we look after it better.
well, that's one of the things, and that's why we created the Acropolis Museum, which is a very beautiful museum. I welcome you to come and visit. And another one said, well, you know, we have so many tourists in London, so many people see it, while they will not see it in Athens. And then the response was, well, maybe we should take it to Beijing, where they even have more people there. So this is, I think, something in common. But I would want to go back also to the education issue and maybe the resilience, which I believe is of great importance. Yes, we need to change our education system. Let us think of a school. We think of a school as sort of a little bit outside. It's a parallel to what's happening in our society. We need to bring societal problems into our schools. It sounds a bit controversial, but if our young students don't discuss the problems we have in our society, and then be able to discuss them, and discuss the conflicts, and discuss the difficulties, and discuss the dilemmas that we have in our societies, that is how we will make them citizens. And that, of course, does not train them only in special skills that are for professions. It is training them to be citizens of tomorrow. Can we see a school a crucible of our future society? Now, I also believe that we have ways to have a resilience through innovation. Because innovation, as you said, it has to have an open mind. But to have an open mind, you do have to have a democracy in the end. So China may be very innovative, but they are basically, I believe they are taking a lot from what they see from around the world and replicating it. But I think we can be much more innovative. And the more we are democratic, the more we are resilient, because we are allowing for new ideas, and absurd ideas, as you said, which in the end are not absurd. Or some may be, and say maybe not. And we also are allowing people to take a risk. What you were saying also, I think, and that's part of the being resilient, or part of being reinventing yourself, you immerse yourself in a very new environment. So it's very different to go to a village in my constituency and speak to the farmers or the shepherds, and very different to be in the UN or in Brussels and speaking with other diplomats. Immersing yourself and taking the risk is also a way to reinvent yourself. But I would add one more thing. Let us think of designing democracy using our new tools. So we have Facebooks and we have Googles and we have Instagram, and I assume that India has its platforms too, and its influencers and all that. Why do we not create a fourth branch of government? Now, I will agree with you that not many people will want it, because some of the people don't want this power, where everybody has a vote and a say, or at least a say, and maybe we'll see a vote. And you can say that, okay, in ancient Athens there were maybe 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 people. They could gather in an area near the Acropolis called the Pnyx, and if you had a bit of a loud voice, they would sit on a rock there a bit higher. They would speak, and everybody pretty much could hear them. Well, if you scale that up to 1 million, or to 10 million, or to 1 billion, like in India, how do you have everybody's voice? Well, if you create an e-agora, Agora is where the marketplace was and the political discussion was. But an electronic one where everybody can be on the website, as I tried as an experiment when I was Prime Minister. And everybody has a unique identity. You can't have bots. You can't have a million voices. You have one equal voice, each one, which is a democratic way. Today we don't have equal voices. You can have a government like Russia, for example, or maybe China, or others too, replicating a voice, and you think it's many citizens, but it's actually non-existent citizens. But if we have one equal voice, and everybody, all the laws are put there, and they are discussions, and you create the algorithms, not for hate, because the social media is creating algorithms to get your attention, to sell you something, and they find the most basic instincts, unluckily, and it looks like hate and fear or sex or whatever. So they promote that a lot, and that of course creates much more discord and lack of cohesion and a lack of community rather than real community. What if you could create an algorithm which would help the debate, bring out the differences, but also help for compromises? And you could create algorithms like this in an AI system. And in an AI system, you could have billions of people participating because that has the capacity to process this data. So let us redesign democracy using these tools which can allow for citizens' participation and, I would say, citizens' innovation in governments and governance. These are the things we need to restart thinking about.
So, Shashi, what are your thoughts on it?
I like the idea, provided the outcome is only advisory. Because we are still an unequal world, we are an unequal society, and there will be some voices that will drown out the others, however good your algorithm is. So I would say this fourth branch of government is an advisory branch. And it will give the rulers of the day, the legislators who after all are elected by the people, an idea of what public opinion seems to want, and then they can judge for themselves how seriously they will take it in voting for it. But I couldn't resist mentioning two other things. One was you talked about the British telling you, oh, there are more people in London, so that's why we're going to keep it here.
Yeah.
That's not an argument they can use with India.
There
are far more people in India.
We should bring it to India then.
Yeah, they should bring it to India. But the second thing, George, I don't know if you'll recall this. Lakshmi got me back in 2009-10 to address one of her conferences, and I spoke on the soft power of India. I was a minister then. And then a few months later, I mean, the damn blessed thing went viral on YouTube and so on and so forth. A few months later, there was an Indian newspaper report saying that the Greek cabinet had viewed my speech and the Prime Minister wanted, as a part of the response to the financial crisis, to actually move towards promoting Greek soft power as part of the answer. So I asked the Greek ambassador whether this was true or whether it was just some enthusiastic Indian journalist. He said, yeah, it actually happened. And it was in the Greek newspapers too. And you must have been the Prime Minister at that time.
I was the Prime Minister, so what I would do, I looked around. We had, during the financial crisis, I think not only the Greek people, but the cabinet was even in more of a crisis. Because every day we had, where are we going bankrupt? What is, who tweeted what, you know, what the markets are doing, what are the bonds like, our interest rates. So people were very nervous, and of course the cabinet was tasked to cut, and reform, and there's a huge burden on them. So I had to do cabinet meetings 2 or 3 times a week. I don't know, I think that no other government has had so many cabinet meetings, and it was a bit of a group therapy also. So what I would do is I would bring in TED Talks before.
It was a TED Talk, yeah.
And I would have them, it was a TED Talk, right. So I would have them listen to a TED Talk and sort of lighten the atmosphere, but also give a bit of inspiration. So Shashi here was a great inspiration for us. Thank you very much.
So the three of us were united all those years ago.
That's right, that's right.
The reunion after 2009. So I just want to wrap up by saying that I think this conversation can go on forever. But I think at the bottom of it, it's sort of, I don't know how many of you, sorry, no questions right now. How many of you saw Three Idiots? There's a scene where the guy goes for an interview and the person says that, "Arey, we are willing to give you the job, but you have such an attitude, like, would you like to tone that a little bit?" And then he says, "Sir, after great, work, I got this attitude. So you can keep your job, but I really want to keep my attitude." And I think, one of the things you both talked about, whether it's a soft power or being able to question, is that attitude which has a combination of hope and humility and humor and fearlessness. And that's what we hope our next generation can have, because it's only in our ability to question, in our ability to have hope and keep moving forward, which is what both of you have done tremendously. You both live very public lives, and we know every dip and up in your lives like under magnifying glass. But still, you both are here giving such amazing conversation. Thank you, George, for coming all the way from Greece, and thank you, Shashi, for making, I know what a busy schedule you have.
Thank you for reuniting me with
Yes,
George. It's
thank
been
all
a
of you. Thank you so much for all of you for being with us.
Thank you very
Thanks.
much. And I just want to say, Shashi is an inspiration because, when you're in politics, there's a big pressure to go for power. And if you don't get into power, you are somewhat disappointed. But I think what Shashi is showing here is that whether you are in or out of power, your voice matters and you can serve. And that is much better than just looking for power. Thank you, Shashi.
Thank you, George. Appreciate it.
And I do want to leave us with the power of stories, because the whole reason why I brought TED to India and did all that was there are amazing voices in India that need to be heard on a global stage, because that can really change. Who would have thought a talk that I had to convince someone to do on a stage in India would be heard in Mysore, would be heard by somebody in Greece in the middle of their problems, that provides a certain solace. So this is the power of stories, and I think I urge everyone to listen and talk and tell the stories and learn how to say it. And we need to know how to tell our stories constantly. So give the stage to listen and tell the stories, which for us at Inc., I just want to wrap up by saying, Inc. stands for innovation and knowledge. So one of the things we say, the reason we do this is that there's a quote I heard, actually there are two quotes. One that says that, there's an African saying that said, unless the lions start telling the stories, the story will always be of the hunter. So we better tell our stories, otherwise National Geographic will tell our stories. And the second thing is there's a quote that says, life ought not to be measured by the number of breaths we take, but by the number of moments that take our breath away. But the number of moments that take our breath away. So if that's true, we should be all greedy of collecting amazing moments. And we call it billionaire of moments. And we say everyone we invite onto a stage, the stage is a sacred place. Storytelling is a sacred activity. And everyone we invite is a billionaire of moments, because that's the only wealth that matters. So I think today we had amazing billionaires of moments on stage, and this is truly the wealth, Lakshmi, that we all can hope to have. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to hold you back for a last minute. Certainly, this has been the most interesting panel for all the 3 days we had at Invest Karnataka. If you agree to it, put your hands together, give a big round of applause. Honorable Minister, the way you were noticing the audience while you were answering to the questions of Lakshmi was commendable. You were making sure you were watching the audience if they are being interested or not, and the way you came to power and that small glimpse of the glass and all, wow, that was just amazing. I think you loved it too, right? Give a huge round of applause to our Honorable Minister. And
Sorry,
George,
one thing I have to say, this is when we had a gathering, Meera Nair and Shashi came together. They both were classmates for theatre. So there is a theatre background in Shashi's life that helps a lot. yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
And George, the way you got into the country as a president, and then the way you prime minister, and you changed the entire circumstances there is just commendable. Thank you so much for joining us and inspiring us. I really wonder, is this your first time for the country?
No.
In India? Many times. But
First
here,
time to Bangalore.
first time in Bangalore. Wow, we'll make it memorable. In our country, the guest is considered to be as God, and we'd like to say one loud namaste with the hands closed together for all the dignitaries on stage at the count of 3. 1, 2, 3, go. Louder, Bangalore energy. 1, 2, 3, go. One final word from you, Shashi sir. How did you like Invest Karnataka, and how was it being here with this gathering in
I
Bangalore?
think it's a terrific idea. I'm very impressed with the quality of the participation from what I've seen. We had a few moments with some of the different investors and entrepreneurs who are here. I saw the speakers lounge and so on. I just congratulate the government of Karnataka for having taken this initiative. I congratulate all of you for being here because that shows you're interested in what we have to say and the experiences and ideas of different people. Neither George nor I is a plutocrat, but we do think. And so we're here to share our thoughts with you all. And thank you so much for giving us this opportunity. I hope it helps build your resilience as Lakshmi wanted us to do. Thanks very much.
George, we would want you to share your experience being here in Namma Bengaluru in Invest Karnataka for the first time.
Well, first of all, a very beautiful hospitality. Thank you very much for the hospitality. I've been warmly welcomed by everyone I've met. A beautiful country, a beautiful area here in Bangalore. I wish I had more time. I did go to the Legislative Assembly, to the Botanical Gardens, so I would love to come back again. And yes, from democracy, I guess, to Dharma, would you say?
Yes.
But we have much in common, Greece and India. Even though so far away, even from ancient times. But I think there's much we can do together as in this world where we are so much connected, but also so many common problems which we can work on together. So yes, for resilience, we need to work together. I'm very happy I'm here. And thank you for also bringing me with this great man here, Shashi,
Yes.
Lakshmi. And Lakshmi too. Thank you very much, Lakshmi. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, George. Thank you for gracing this occasion. We'd like to acknowledge your presence on behalf of every person present out here. Lakshmi, could you please step forward? Let's acknowledge the presence of Shashi Tharoor.
Shashi, come here.
Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together. Give a big round of applause to Shashi sir for gracing this occasion. Thank you so much for being with us, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I'll go this side.
Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for George for gracing this occasion.
Here, George. Shashi, come. Just come on.